Hi, in this video I'm going to take a break from my QGIS tutorials and actually take a look at another new open source tool that I came across recently called Aerialod. Now Aerialod is basically a really neat little tool for making nice visualizations of elevation data, or as I'll show you a bit later on, actually any kind of single band data that you might want to represent using a height layer. So you can find Aerialod at this website at the top here. I'll put a link to it below the video, or you can just Google Aerialod and this comes up at the top. So it's a free open source tool. If you want the 64-bit Windows version, it only has Windows versions at the moment, so if you're not on Windows, sorry about that. So you can click to download it. It downloads pretty quickly, it's only about 2 megabytes. Download as a zip file, simply copy the Aerialod folder and paste it wherever you want to run it. So in my case I've just pasted it straight into the C drive, and you can get started straight away by just double clicking on aerialod.exe. The first time you run it, Windows may pop up with a warning because it's a little used exe file at the moment. It's not quite sure what it is, but I've checked it out. You can click OK, let it run. There doesn't seem to be any issues with it. So when it loads up, this is the screen that you'll be greeted with a very simple elevation raster. So if we want to load our data in, the first thing we need to do is click on this little thumbnail over here, and it helpfully has a couple of demo data sets included for us, but just to show that it works pretty well with anything, I'm going to jump straight into my own data. So I've got some in here, and I'm going to use this, which is part of the or a data set from NASA's SRTM mission, the Shuttle Radar Topography mission. So this is a 30-meter global elevation data set, and I've clicked out a section showing North Wales. So you can see straight away it loads and it looks pretty nice. It's got nice lighting effects, which is really the key functionality of this tool, being able to give some really effective lighting in order to highlight our elevation data. One thing we will notice is that while North Wales is pretty mountainous, it's definitely not this mountainous, and that leads us nicely into some of the options over here. So one of the first things we'll want to do is to adjust the scale. So basically in this case our vertical scale is out, and we can click and drag to reduce it, or we can type in here, and I'm actually going to go right the way down to 0.1. Which reduces it considerably, but actually is a much more realistic representation of the terrain of the area. So right click allows you to rotate around, middle button pans, and left click, as you can see, applies a slight blurring effect. I'll come back to that a bit later on. Right click removes that blurring effect again. So we've got the scale set, and I'm now actually going to jump straight from here over to the left hand menu. So the right hand menu initially gives us all of our tools for loading and manipulating the elevation data itself. The first set of menus we have on the left here, as you can see, is lighting. So now I've panned around, everything looks pretty washed out, and the reason for that is that I'm kind of directly opposite the direction that the sun is shining from, so all of the shadows are hidden. Luckily we can easily adjust that with these two angle settings here. So the one on the right is the direction the sun is coming from, and you can see as I click and drag that round, you can see it kind of changing interactively in the preview. So I can keep going until I get some nice shading, helping me to pick out the contours of the terrain. The other one is the height of the sun in the sky. So the higher that is, the smaller the shadows will be, because it's kind of almost directly above. And the lower that is, the longer the shadows will be, as I'm effectively making the sun lower in the sky. Some of these other settings on here I've played around with. I'm going to be honest, a lot of the lighting settings don't seem, in my examples anyway, and I've used a few different data sets, to have massive impacts on the output. One of the things that will is changing some of the lighting colours. So if we want to kind of give our lighting a bit of a tint, maybe a golden evening light, We can make it slightly yellowish. We do have a few different options for the sky settings down here. We can have, and you'll see if I change this, that also changes the atmosphere color. We can have various different sets of settings. So the best thing to do here is to experiment. So this allows kind of slightly more scattering, various atmospheric effects, or we can also load HDR radiance files, which I have to admit are not something that I'm massively familiar with, but there's 3 examples in here, and actually they seem to be quite effective. I'm just going to change that back to grey there. The middle one always gives like a moonlight effect, which I actually quite like personally. So this allows you to change the lighting settings. The second one here has, again, more settings for calculating how the lighting interacts with the landscape. Again, from my experimentation, they don't have massive effects in most cases. There's very subtle variations. So you can have a play around, turn these on and off. But we can see if I kind of turn everything off, it does flatten out slightly and reduce the quality because it's not carrying out some of the calculations. Anti-aliasing in particular has a massive impact here. But I can turn all of these on and you can see the effects are there but fairly minimal. The last one allows you to, in theory, set up a grid, although I've not had much luck so far getting an effective grid on here, and frankly can't see too many applications where you'd really want a grid. It's kind of making nice clear visualizations seems to be the strong point of this particular piece of software. We can add a background color in. Again, I've not found that to have much of an effect. What does have an effect is ground. So ground is basically the background color that we can see surrounding our elevation layer. So if we wanted to create, say, a bit more of a sunny sky background, for example, we could lighten that up. It seems to work better, in my opinion, with lighter colours, but that might just be my personal taste. So we'll now come back over to the right hand side here. So we saw scale, adjusted essentially the vertical exaggeration of the data set. Offset allows us to raise or lower it relative to 0. So in my case, the data came in or aligned correctly with the floor at 0. We can actually drop it slightly below 0, which can be quite nice for giving this flooding effect, bringing kind of water into the scene. But some data sets don't actually come in correctly, and you'll see this when I show you a second data set in a minute, that actually it will come out way above ground level and we'll have to adjust the offset to set it down to 0. Step and LOD, level of detail, affect how the terrain draws, as do these cube, poly and surf options up here. So to explain what I mean, I'm just going to zoom right in a bit more on the data here, and what you'll see when I zoom in is that actually our data set, when we get close in, looks quite blocky, almost a kind of Mindscape-esque, Lego-y landscape, and that's because we're on the cube option here. So this literally extrudes each individual pixel from our elevation data set up to its height, creating these kind of blocky looking landscapes. And the step and LOD settings basically adjust the kind of vertical and horizontal merging of these. You can see if I increase LOD, it very quickly becomes much blockier. So for both of these, 0 is actually our highest setting. So if you want to show the greatest amount of detail, keep step and level of detail set to 0. If you want to reduce that slightly to purposely get a blockier effect, then you can increase those a little bit. We can also set the ground color here. So as I said, I find lighter colors seem to work well. If we wanted to go for blue or a nice Martian ready landscape, we can change those settings here. So the second set of options up here are the camera settings. And one of the most interesting ones to play around with is this aperture setting. So if I zoom back out a second, maybe tilt down a little bit. So earlier on I clicked and you saw the scene go slightly blurry. And that's linked to this aperture setting here. So it's exactly like the aperture on a camera. If you change the aperture setting, it gives you a nice blurred background. So at the moment we've got aperture 25 and I simply clicked on a point and it applied that aperture setting, and you can see we now have this kind of tilt shift effect where I have a strip a similar distance away, all in kind of nice crisp contrast, fading out as we go back. Aperture of 25 is the default. That seems quite strong to me. If we kind of reduce that slightly, I actually find about 5 seems to work quite well. We can still kind of pick up some of the details of the background. It's a much more natural fade out compared to 25, which is quite harsh. Again, I found a lot of these other settings not to have massive impacts. Blade, just the kind of blade effect with the aperture blur. But again, from what I've seen, the impact is pretty negligible. Field of view and focus, again, do have some effects in terms of kind of sharpening and lessening focus, but once it actually finishes drawing, again, the impact seems generally fairly minimal. Possibly if we change extreme values, focus down to 1, we do start to lose that focus. So there we go. So that kind of allows us to manually set our focus point, but it's actually much easier just to do it by clicking. So you can see when I click here, it's also changing that focus value. So generally speaking, that's going to be a much easier way to do it. Exposure will have an impact. Again, changes as you would expect, the kind of exposure brightness of the shot. So we could brighten that up a little bit if we wanted to. Vignette allows you to add a vignetting effect. And again, the gamma slider does have a bit more of an impact than some of the others. So we can see how increasing or reducing the gamma changes the kind of intensity to some extent of the lighting on here. So that allows us to play around with our camera lens, the focus, line up our shot nicely, and get the kind of effects that we want. And then the final set of options over here are basically our image export options. So we can export a photo, a single still. By default, the resolution is set to 1024 by 1024, but we can change that to whatever resolution we want if we want a much higher resolution export. It's worth noting that these export buttons at the bottom here don't export the scene. These ones export essentially the raw data set in these formats. So obviously PNG, JPEG and TIFF are all image files. The PLY is a mesh layer. So if we actually wanted to then export this mesh for use in something else, like say Blender for example, for further kind of 3D rendering and effects, we could actually use this export PLY option to convert our elevation model into a mesh layer. If we want to export the picture as we see it, we have to use the render option down here, and that will then give it a default name, hit save, and you can see up here it's working along. It can take a minute or two to fully render the scene at the quality that you want. The other option we have is turntable, which it's not going to let me go to at the moment. I might just stop this render so that I can show you that option. So what turntable allows you to do is basically export multiple images rotating around your scene. So you can see here by default it's rotating 360 degrees around, producing 6 frames. So every so many degrees as we rotate around. If we want, we can add a blur effect so it looks as though it's kind of got movement blur as it's rotating. And essentially what we could do, it will export an image for each of these points, so 6 still images. We could then, if we wanted to, turn those into, say, an animated GIF to effectively give the effect of rotating around our scene. So that's all of the basic functions of Aerialod. And the key thing it can do is produce, if we look at some of the ones I've made earlier in this export folder, some really quite nice 3D renderings of elevation data. This one here is an example of the turntable effect. So you can see how it gives that rotation effect when we've exported the data. So the final thing that I just wanted to note, as I said, although this is set up for elevation data, actually we can visualize any single band raster image this way. So I'm just going to show an example of visualizing crime data. So this is a crime data set, some crime hotspots that I produced using QGIS, and we can actually visualize the peaks and troughs of that data as well using Aerialod. So this is an example where by default it's extruded an awfully long way, and through a bit of experimentation, I mean, we can just drag down and you can see it dropping, but for some reason I've discovered that minus 10,000 actually aligns it correctly, and in this case we want to increase the scale slightly, so let's put the scale back to 1, and we can see that we now have this crime data set with the hotspots represented as these big peaks and lower points represented by the absence of data. So maybe let's zoom in a bit closer to these, this big peak here. Again, we could play around with our lighting settings, maybe reduce the angle in the sky to give some longer shadows coming away from these peaks. And click to give the blurred background effect. So you can see that I've gone to the all option now, so I actually have all the settings visible. So actually in this case maybe we need to increase our aperture a little bit more. Let's go back to the original 25. And there we go, we've now visualized our crime data, allowing us to focus in on the main peak here, blur the background away, and if we wanted to, we could now render this scene, export that as a nice visual that we could then use to illustrate a report or something like that that we're producing. So that's Aerialod. So it's not full GIS, it's pretty limited in terms of functionality at the moment, but it is only at version 0.1, so it is possible that they might add more features in the future. It would be great to be able to kind of add, say, a base map layer so that we can actually visualize where this data set is, or maybe use color ramps or something when we're visualizing the data to help kind of tint the elevation data. But it's still just purely for creating some nice lighting and visual effects with our elevation data. It's a pretty nifty tool, nice small file size. You know, you can easily download this on any computer and create some quite effective graphics. So there you go, that's Aerialod. Thanks a lot. Please remember, if you found this video useful, do subscribe to the channel and like the video, and keep an eye out for more videos coming soon. Thanks.